We are standing here in the old city. Behind me you can see the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, how it's called in Arabic. You can see the Dome of Al-Aqsa, the Mosque of Al-Aqsa actually. We cannot see from here, but actually next to the Temple Mount, or one of the walls of the Temple Mount, is obviously the Western Wall, which is very close to us. And in the other side we can see the Jewish quarter, one of the quarters of the old city. From here, the tour is actually goes from the old city. We are going actually to the neighborhood of SIlwan, and known also the archaeological site which is known as City of David. But Jerusalem, the old city, also contains a lot of the most important holy and sacred sites to the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. What makes Jerusalem very unique because of that, and also very tense because of this religious beliefs. We are heading towards the archaeological site. We call it City of David. Now, the archaeological site, City of David, is also known as Ancient Jerusalem, the place where Jerusalem began 4,000 years ago. When we're talking about the old city, we're talking maybe about the last 2,000 years, more or less. And now we are heading to the place where Jerusalem began, as a very small city that was established by a culture, we call them the Canaanites. They established Jerusalem in the 18th, 17th century BCE, and later on, a few hundred years later, this Jerusalem became the capital of the Judean kingdom. And this is where we are heading. This is also the place that's known as SIlwan, the Palestinian neighborhood. And it's located exactly in the same place, and that's what makes it very unique. We are talking about, from here we can see neighborhood, cars, streets, but next to it, excavation. The antiquities in general are under the streets, the houses, and everything in here. The idea of the tour is to talk about the role of archaeology in the political conflict, how archaeology is used as a political tool in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we are going to talk about also the way the historic narrative plays kind of a role by, you know, if it's the Israelis who mainly come and say that we have historic rights here, which we do, we have historic rights obviously in the land of Israel, but the archaeology is a tool that many times is used to kind of to justify the Israeli hold in all kind of controversial places in East Jerusalem, but not only in East Jerusalem, also in other places. We are entering now the visitor center of City of David. And what is interesting about this place is that we are actually went from the old city straight to SIlwan, crossed the main street without even noticing too much. We entered immediately to the archaeological site, to the touristic area, and by doing so we immediately avoid seeing the present life, seeing the Palestinian life as well. And we believe this was made deliberately, obviously, in order to make us feel as tourists in touristic site, archaeological site. Okay, so this is the visitor center that was mainly developed in the last 20 years. Since 2005, last 15 years, and we have a few different players here, which is very interesting. The archaeological excavation that we saw is actually done mainly by the Israeli Antiquity Authority, but what is interesting is to see the two symbols that we're having here. This is the symbol of the Nature and Park Authority, governmental body, that's responsible to all the national parks and the natural reservations in Israel, like Caesarea, Masada, whatever you're familiar with, many actually, dozens. And this is the interesting symbol. This is a symbol which says here, Ir David, ancient Jerusalem. This is the symbol of this particular archaeological site, but also the symbol of Elad Association, Elad Foundation, a settlers organization that began settling in SIlwan in the early 90s and got responsibility over the archaeological site in the beginning of the 21st century. So we're having here the two symbols. Remember, this is the governmental body. This is a private company or private NGO actually. This is a private NGO that actually involve, and the main target is to settle in East Jerusalem and develop a Jewish presence, we can say, in Jerusalem in general, in East Jerusalem. That's what is very important. Elad began by settling in Silwan, and in the beginning, when we are standing here at the lookout, we can see between the trees all kind of houses. So in the beginning, in the early 90s, Elad actually took over different houses. We can see these houses with the Israeli flags, houses that they got from the Israeli government, and this is what the beginning of the settlement. About a decade later, they got responsibility over the archaeological site by understanding that the archaeological site gives them, first of all, a lot of land that belongs to the touristic site, like we're having here, but also a control over the archaeological narrative or the historic narrative, which is the idea is to bring people here and to show them Jerusalem in the way they would like to show Jerusalem, which means a lot of information about Jerusalem and how it's important to the Israelis or to the Jewish people, and information about why it's legitimate, more or less, to settle in Silwan. But also, Silwan is unique and important because what we can see around us, the strategic location we are talking about. We are standing already in city of David, Silwan, and from here we can see maybe the most sensitive or the core of the political conflict in many ways, Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif and the old city in general. Silwan, we can see the houses of Silwan, the Palestinian houses of Silwan, is actually the closest neighborhood to this location, to the old city, if you want, to the Jewish quarter as well, to the Temple Mount, obviously, and also very close to the Green Line, the border that used to be between East and West Jerusalem, or between Jordan and Israel until 67, is only a few hundred meters to the west, over there. And in the same time, Silwan is also the village that also close to the Temple Mount, close to the Mount of Olives. Mount of Olives is very important mountain, or very important Jewish cemetery to the Jewish people, obviously. And from here we can see the rest of Silwan, the other slope, the houses of Silwan, which is actually a very large neighborhood. This is all the location. So for Elad, to have a presence here is a presence not only in a Palestinian village, also very close to one of the most sensitive and important places in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and definitely in many ways continuation of what we have in West Jerusalem towards East Jerusalem. Like having a settlement very close to West Jerusalem helped them to justify their settlement here. Having said that, we are going to follow the story of the narrative, how the historic narrative is actually playing a role in this conflict. And from here we're going to see the ruins of what we're calling the Judean period and other period, and talk about archaeology, narratives, and how it's been explained. So we are standing at the Acropolis of Jerusalem. Acropolis means the place where the upper class used to live, where we are expecting to find the palaces, sometimes the temples of the upper class, obviously, of the people of the city of Jerusalem in this case. When we're talking about archaeology of ancient Jerusalem, we have ruins from what we are calling the Middle Bronze Age or the Canaanite period, 18th, 17th century BC, the time when Jerusalem was established. We also have ruins later, if you want, 15, 12, 13th century BC, maybe 11th century BC. We also have archaeological evidence here from what we are calling Judean Jerusalem, Jerusalem of Judea, 9th century BC, 8th, 7th century. We have here archaeological evidence of the 6th century, the destruction time, when the destruction layer, when Jerusalem was destroyed, probably by the Babylonians, and we have the continuation after that of the Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman periods. All of these archaeological ruins are located and were found, and the archaeologist community and the scholars do agree about these periods. The interesting thing is about the 10th century BC. The 10th century BC is the time that related to King David and after that King Solomon. They are both dated to the 10th century BC. And although we have a kind of almost confirmed evidence before the time of David and after the time of David, the most contested period is the 10th century BC. For more than 100 years, archaeologists excavated in the city of David, ancient Jerusalem, and haven't found enough archaeological evidence of the 10th century BC. And in 2004, 2005, an Israeli archaeologist came here and claimed later that she believed she found archaeological evidence of the King David Palace. And she identified this big stone that we see here to the 10th century BC. And she's saying this is part of King David Palace. This view, as we know, is very much contested by most of the scholars, but this is the main narrative that's been told to the visitors who come into the city of David. And this narrative is also important because King David is not just a religious figure. He is a religious figure to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but he's also an important figure in the national identity of the Israelis, like the forefather of the Israeli people, the king who established his kingdom in Jerusalem. And this is something that plays an important role when visitors coming here and they're hearing that they are coming to the first capital of the Israeli people and justify the whole Israeli settlement today. And this is why we think why it's so important to the government, but also mainly to the settlers, to Elad people, to emphasize King David here and to emphasize how he belongs here and to justify the whole settlement they are having here. But also it shows why it's important to Elad to be involved in archaeological excavation. It's not just about bringing people to hear about the history. It's about people to hear about, in many ways, the nationalistic narrative of the Israeli people and to justify the settlement of East Jerusalem. And to come and say East Jerusalem is mainly belongs to us, the Israelis. It's holy to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But eventually, as a people, it's more important to us than the others. And also, Elad understood by having the touristic site, it gives them an option to bring hundreds of thousands of visitors, all the Israelis, students coming to City of David, Israeli soldiers coming to City of David, and not necessarily hearing the multi-layer story about the different cultures, different religions, and different people, or why King David important to Christianity, why King David important to Islam. No, what they are hearing is King David and how he related to the Israeli people, and also other figures like Jeremiah the prophet or Hezekiah the king, but mainly with these connections to the Israeli people. And from here we're going down to an area that archaeologists called Area G. It's an archaeological area. It's part of what we are calling the Acropolis, or the governmental area. This area behind me was excavated by the British, but also was excavated by the Israelis in 1978 and created a huge excitement. Because what happened is that when the Israeli archaeologists excavated here, they revealed layers from what we are calling Judean Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a Judean period. Archaeological evidence from the 8th century BC, 7th century BC, and like we said before, the destruction layer of the 6th century BCE, very relevant to what we know also from the Bible. And it caused a huge excitement because here it's kind of the biblical stories becoming alive again with these archaeological remains. And today there is consensus among the international archaeologist community or international scholars that this Jerusalem is definitely exists here. Jerusalem of the later Judean kings is definitely here. Jerusalem of the destruction is definitely here. In the same time, we know that these Judean people who lived in Judea have many customs and many way of life that similar to what we know from the whole region. The people of Moab, Edom, back then, today what we are calling Jordan or Syria and all, the whole region has a very similar way of life. And that's what we can see also when we do the archaeology here. So from here we are going out. This is one of the touristic areas, and we're going out to see to the village or to the neighborhood SIlwan. We are always in the neighborhood in the same time that we are in the archaeological site, but we're going to hear some of the stories about how it's to live in archaeological site for Palestinians, how it's to live with the settlers in City of David in general. Behind me we can see two houses. To my right there's a settler's house. You can see the renovation of the settler's house. We call it Roslan family house, although Roslan is a Palestinian family, but this is a settler's house that was taken by the settlers in 2005. In the other side we can see a Palestinian house, and before the Palestinian we can see kind of a structure with pillars with somebody who tried to build a house but actually was stopped in the middle. And this is a very interesting story about how is it to live in a national park in East Jerusalem. Okay? We mentioned before the Nature and Park Authority, but the Nature and Park Authority is not only responsible to the archaeological site, also responsible to what is happening in SIlwan in general, because the whole neighborhood of SIlwan is part of a national park, which means the residents of SIlwan need to get permission not only from the municipality if they would like to build, also from the Nature and Park Authority. In one side we see a case where the settlers got permission to renovate their house, and in the other side we see the case of Karain family, which actually asked permission from the Israeli Antiquity Authority and got permission to build, but the Nature and Park Authority told them they cannot build a new house in their own property because it's damaging the character of the national park. And that's something that the Nature and Park Authority has the power to prevent or to allow. Obviously, we are talking about a living neighborhood, but that's one of the examples how difficult it is when the government decided to hold this place a national park. So we are going out now to the main street of SIlwan, what the Hilwa Street if you want. This street is actually the same street that we saw in the beginning of our tour. This street leads to the old city. And obviously immediately when we're entering the street we can see that it's much more noisy, but we can maybe feel much more that this is a Palestinian street. We can see the Palestinian houses, and we can see also the location of SIlwan next to the old city, the wall of the old city, the Jewish quarter. And we're having just next to us here and what is called archaeological excavation. We can see here with the truck and all the soil, these bags are actually bags of soil that was removed from the archaeological excavation. The archaeological excavation is not taking place only here behind the fence that we're having here. We're talking here about a very long excavation that's taking place under the houses of both sides. If you're looking at the houses in front of us, imagine that under them and under this street there is a long archaeological excavation, what we are calling horizontal excavation, that connects two archaeological open spaces. The story of the excavation here is very interesting because usually in Israel and all over the world you don't excavate under people's house. People's houses and people's property is not a place that you do excavations unless you reach an agreement with the people, but it's not something common at all, obviously. You respect people's property. But also it's interesting because one of the main plans here is to do these excavations in order to create what we talked before about the touristic trail that will avoid or deny the presence of the Palestinian life here today. The idea is to talk about King David. The idea is to talk maybe about the Second Temple period, to show the archaeology of that period, to show Jerusalem, how it's important to the Israeli people during the history, but also to ignore the life of SIlwan today, like they are less important. And this is why we're having this excavation under the houses. And this is why the Israeli Antiquity Authority is doing this excavation for a long time. Something very important to mention about this excavation, to make the academic story short, in archaeology we don't excavate horizontally. We don't excavate under people's house horizontally to another place. We're excavating from the surface all the way down. This is the only way to do a professional excavation, And the Israeli Antiquity Authority is willing to do this horizontal excavation, according to our understanding, because it has also they have a political pressure to create this kind of an underground archaeological city. One of the things that we see during the excavation of the tunnels is that many houses that build above the excavation, people complain about damages and about cracks in the houses. And when we monitor the houses, we found 38 houses with more than 200 people who are living in these houses that having cracks and damages to the walls or to the floors and so on. And it's very interesting to see that damages to the houses we see mainly along the line of the tunnels, and in other locations in the village or in the neighborhood we haven't found any damages. We cannot prove that the damages was made because of the excavation, but definitely the main project that we know about is this tunnels excavation. The residents are complaining about the damages for years, and unfortunately the Israeli Antiquity Authority or the Jerusalem municipality didn't try to provide them any answer, or even didn't try to do a proper monitoring and proper engineering testing in order to understand how to stabilize the houses and what is the real reason of these damages. So we did a short tour from the old city straight to SIlwan, city of David. We saw the archaeology, we saw the village or the neighborhood, and we can see that when we're talking about the political struggle over East Jerusalem, first of all we mention the role of the historic narrative here, to whom Jerusalem belongs, because eventually the question of Jerusalem is not just about property or land, it's very much about symbols, emotions, religious beliefs and so on, but also history. And archaeology plays an important role here. But also we talked about the different players. So we're all familiar with the settlers of East Jerusalem, and here we talked about El-Ad, one of the most powerful settlers organization in Israel, definitely in East Jerusalem, that decided strategically to use archaeology and tourism in general in order to strengthen their hold in East Jerusalem. But next to them we have governmental body like the Nature and Park Authority, since it's a national park, the Israeli Antiquity Authority, who's doing the excavation. We choose city of David, SIlwan, as a case study. First of all, because we think that Jerusalem eventually is the core of the political conflict. And both sides believe they have historic rights here. Both sides are not willing to give up of any connection to Jerusalem and claiming sovereignty over Jerusalem. And SIlwan is a very good example to what's happening with this political conflict and how archaeology is used here. This was a very short tour in one location, which is the city of David, SIlwan. We think that in many ways it's a good example of what's happening around Jerusalem, around the political conflict over Jerusalem. But we also invite you to learn more about what's happening in Jerusalem following our website, our updates in Facebook or email, and also other organizations who are involved in East Jerusalem. Eventually, we're talking about land, we're talking about narrative. We in Emek Shaveh believe that they are both connected. Thank you very much, and see you in our next virtual or physical tour.